At 70, beneath the white-hot shimmer of Emmy night lights, Reba McEntire raised her hand, and a black ring flashed like a sealed confession. Reporters called Rex Lynn her fiancé. She didn't correct them. But that wasn't the silence the town had been waiting on. For decades, Nashville back rooms and Hollywood corridors traded a quieter rumor. The woman who sang other people's heartbreak had been guarding one of her own. It wasn't a chart statistic. It wasn't a feud. It was a family line written without blood, stitched together by late-night rides, side-stage prayers, and a promise that outlived applause. In 1989, Reba married the man who helped turn her into a touring force and stepped into a home already moving at full speed. 3 children, 3 stories, 3 shadows. One of them, Brandon Blackstock, would become the center of whispers that never quite burned out. Was it distance, control, business, or something more fragile? A love built in the in-between places, where stepmother becomes simply mom, and no one says it out loud. The answers did not arrive as headlines. They came at the end of a road no parent, by blood or by vow, ever chooses. Sterilite, a diagnosis you cannot outsing, a goodbye that rearranges your name. When Reba finally spoke, the words weren't polished for radio. They were plain, unguarded, and impossible to misunderstand. Irreplaceable. This isn't the story of a crown reclaimed or a chart conquered. It is the file Reba never wanted opened, the one about love that survives contracts, careers, and the night the music stops. And tonight, we open it.
Long before the sequins and the spotlight, before the red hair became an emblem of defiance, Reba McEntire was a barefoot ranch girl from Chalky, Oklahoma, a town so small it barely had a signpost. She was born in 1955, the third of 4 children, tiny enough to fit in her father's palm. Her father, Clark McEntire, was a rodeo legend, 3-time world champion steer roper, and a man carved out of dust and silence. He never said, "I love you." He believed love was proven in work, not words. Her mother, Jacqueline, was the opposite, a gentle woman who once dreamed of singing on the radio, but traded microphones for chalk and a one-room schoolhouse. Every dawn, before the sun lifted the frost, Reba was out in the fields, mending fences, wrestling calves, gathering eggs from 200 chickens. She learned rhythm not from a metronome, but from the sound of hooves against dry soil. At night, inside a 1952 Buick that doubled as a classroom, her mother taught harmony to her children. That old car became their first stage, and the singing McEntire's their first act. But even in those moments of laughter and 4-part harmony, Reba felt the weight of expectation, to be tough like her father, patient like her mother, and invisible like every woman who worked behind a man's success. No one knew it yet, but that little girl with calloused hands was building the armor she would need for Nashville, for Hollywood, and for every loss that would follow. She wasn't just being raised, she was being forged.
By 19, Reba McEntire had traded the Oklahoma dust for the neon hum of Nashville, a city where dreams sound like guitars and heartbreak smells like whiskey. She arrived with a quarter horse named Champ, a borrowed guitar, and a voice no one quite knew what to do with. Her first audition ended in silence. One producer told her she sounded like a goat bleeding in the wind. Another said her Oklahoma drawl made her too raw for radio. Still, she sang. Bars, rodeos, county fairs. She sang until her fingers bled. In 1975, during a rodeo in Oklahoma City, she was asked to sing the national anthem. Among the crowd was Red Steagall, a country star who heard something no label executive had. Within months, Mercury Records called. But the dream came with a contract that read more like a trap. They didn't want Reba McEntire. They wanted another Dolly Parton. Producers flattened her accent, rewrote her lyrics, and trimmed her budget from $15,000 to $8,000. She was told to smile more, to sound softer, to disappear. Her first single, I Don't Want to Be a One-Night Stand, earned only $847 in royalties. Her van broke down outside Amarillo in a blizzard. She and her band burned guitar cases to stay warm. Still, she refused to stop. When her grandmother fell ill, she recorded A Poor Man's Roses in one take through tears. The label shelved it. But Reba kept that recording, not as proof of failure, but of something Nashville hadn't learned yet. Pain has perfect pitch. By 1980, she'd released 3 albums that sold fewer than 50,000 copies combined. She was exhausted, broke, and ready to walk away. Then one night, she slammed her fist on a studio table and said, "If I'm going down as me." That decision, that single act of defiance, would change everything. Because the next time Reba McEntire stepped to the microphone, she didn't sing to please anyone. She sang to survive.
The year was 1983. The crowd at the Ryman Auditorium rose to its feet as a red-haired woman from Chalky, Oklahoma, walked into the spotlight. For years, Reba McEntire had been treated as a sideshow act, too country, too plain, too small. That night, she proved them all wrong. Her single, Can't Even Get the Blues, had just climbed to #1. The girl who once sang to cattle now sang to millions. She didn't just hit notes, she told stories, real ones, the kind that left lipstick stains on bar napkins and tears on steering wheels. The world started calling her the voice of every woman who ever stayed too long. Her album, My Kind of Country, broke the rules. Raw twang, no pop gloss. Within months, it sold over 1 million copies, outselling Dolly Parton's latest release. For the first time, Reba walked into the CMA Awards not as an underdog, but as a contender. When they called her name for Female Vocalist of the Year, the applause was deafening. But backstage, the victory didn't taste sweet. Dolly's manager accused her team of cheating votes. Papers ran headlines like the redhead rivalry. Reba had wanted respect. She got a war. Through the noise, she kept touring. 157 shows a year, $12,000 a night, always smiling, always flawless. Until one night in Houston, under a flood of stage lights, her $800 sequin gown ripped open from shoulder to waist. Her bra was fully exposed before 20,000 people. The crowd gasped. Reba laughed. "Y'all got your money's worth tonight," she said, clutching the fabric and finishing the song. That photo, the torn dress, the grin, the grit, became a symbol. The girl from the ranch had become an icon. By 1985, her albums went double platinum. She was the highest-grossing female artist in country music. But while the spotlight grew brighter, her private life grew darker. Her husband, Charlie Battles, the former rodeo man she'd married at 21, had grown resentful. He called her music embarrassing. He demanded she quit touring. One night, after another argument, Reba wrote a song that would define her heartbreak. Somebody Should Leave. It wasn't fiction. It was a diary entry set to melody. In 1987, she walked out, with a guitar, a suitcase, and a promise to never let anyone silence her again. The divorce cost her money, but it gave her freedom. 2 years later, that freedom led her straight into the arms of a man who understood the business, her manager, Narvel Blackstock. He had been by her side since 1979, handling the numbers, the bookings, the image. When they married in 1989, Reba didn't just gain a husband, she gained a family. 3 stepchildren, Brandon, Chetty, and Shauna. She often said, they were his before, but they became ours. Hollywood called it a business merger. Nashville whispered it was control. But to Reba,
It felt like peace, at least at first. She moved them all into a $15 million Tennessee estate. Family dinners replaced hotel room meals. Brandon, the middle child, had his mother's wit and his father's ambition. He followed her everywhere, backstage, on set, on tour buses. He called her mom before the tabloids ever did. As her star rose higher, Grammy wins, movie roles, magazine covers, she started building a second empire, her heart. To the world, she was Reba the superstar, but to Brandon, she was simply the woman who packed his lunches and told him to keep dreaming. But the fame that lifted their family would soon begin to pull them apart. Behind the gold records and red carpets, tensions grew. Whispers of jealousy, control, and emotional distance. Reba's drive for perfection left little space for anything else. Narvel managed her like a client, not a wife. And Brandon, growing older, started to chase his own path, one that would eventually lead to Hollywood headlines, heartbreak, and the shadow of his famous stepmother's legacy. For now, though, in the late 1980s, Reba McEntire stood at the top of the world, adored, envied, unstoppable. Every ticket sold, every camera flash, every note she sang felt like proof that the little girl from the ranch had finally made it. But the thing about crowns is, they always come with weight. And the higher she climbed, the more it began to press down.
Success is loud, but grief whispers. On the night of March 16, 1991, Reba McEntire had finished a private concert for IBM executives in San Diego. Her band, her brothers in sound, boarded a small jet bound for Fort Wayne, Indiana. Reba stayed behind with her husband Narvel and her stylist, just for the night. At 1:45 a.m., the plane crashed into the side of Otay Mountain. All 10 on board were killed instantly. When Reba got the call, she didn't scream. She didn't move. She just whispered, "All of them." The next morning, she went to the crash site. The sky smelled like jet fuel and rain. Pieces of guitar strings and sheet music lay in the dirt. Reporters weren't allowed in, only Reba. She picked up a burned piece of fabric and said, "They were my family." For months, she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the mountain. Therapists called it survivor's guilt. She called it punishment. But instead of disappearing, she turned pain into purpose. 8 months later, she released For My Broken Heart, an album born from ashes. It debuted at #1, selling 4 million copies. Every show after that, she sang to ghosts, and every song was a eulogy. But behind the applause, her life was unraveling. Narvel, her husband, her manager, controlled everything: her tours, her contracts, even her interviews. What began as trust slowly twisted into dependence. He decided where she sang, what she wore, how she spoke. Reba once said, "He was the steering wheel, I was the car." The tabloids called them a power couple. Privately, they were a hierarchy. She was the star, but Narvel owned the spotlight. Still, she stayed, partly for love, partly for loyalty, and partly for the family she'd found in his children, especially Brandon. By the late 90s, Brandon Blackstock was no longer the boy following her tour bus. He was a man finding his own place in the industry, managing artists, building a name. He inherited Narvel's charm and Reba's drive. To her, he was living proof that family didn't need shared DNA. She told friends, "He's my son in every way that matters." But the same ambition that once connected them began to pull them apart. Hollywood whispered about tension, competition,
even betrayal. Brandon's choices in business sometimes clashed with hers, and Narvel, the patriarch in the middle, started drifting away emotionally, caught between the empire they built and the freedom he missed. Reba kept smiling for the cameras, kept performing, kept pretending everything was fine. But offstage, the silence returned. The same silence she'd known as a girl on the ranch. The same kind that swallows words before they reach the heart. In 2015, after 26 years of marriage, Narvel told her he was leaving. No scandal, no fight, just done. The divorce stripped her of more than $47 million and the man who had managed her entire career. Reba said she felt like she'd been dropped off at the end of a long road with no map. The woman who once commanded arenas now stood alone in her kitchen, staring at a calendar filled with empty dates. But loneliness didn't break her, it refined her. She became her own manager, her own voice, her own salvation. And while the world celebrated her comeback, the Broadway roles, The Voice, the TV series Reba, few knew the private heartbreak she was carrying, because in her silence, another story was unfolding, one not of fame, but of family. Brandon, now a husband and father, was living his own complicated Hollywood tale, married to singer Kelly Clarkson, juggling fame, fatherhood, and the same relentless industry that had once nearly consumed his stepmother. Reba stayed close, protective, proud, and quiet. Always quiet. But fate, as always, had one more cruel verse to play.
August 2025. The sun over Tennessee was unforgiving that morning, sharp and colorless, the kind that makes silence heavier. Reba McEntire was on set filming Happy's Place when her phone rang. The voice on the other end was trembling. It was Shelby, her only biological son. He didn't need to finish the sentence. She already knew. Brandon Blackstock, her stepson, her friend, the boy who once called her mom before the tabloids ever did, was gone. Melanoma, stage 4, 48 years old. The news hit like a collapse from the inside. She'd survived plane crashes, heartbreak, betrayal, and fame's cruel spotlight. But this was different. This was the kind of loss no award, no prayer, no song could hold. For days, she stayed out of sight. Her team canceled appearances, citing personal reasons. But those who knew her understood. The woman who had sung through death and divorce had finally found a silence she couldn't outsing. When she returned, not to a stage but to Instagram, it wasn't for a statement. It was a confession. A single post. A photo of Brandon from years ago, smiling in a baseball cap, and a caption that read, "He's been my son forever. I loved him before I was supposed to, and I'll love him long after I'm gone." No hashtags, no PR polish, just truth. The kind that strips fame of its armor. Kelly Clarkson, Brandon's ex-wife, canceled her Las Vegas residency to stay with their children. Fans flooded Reba's comments with condolences, but she didn't respond. She was back in Chokey, Oklahoma, at the ranch where she once learned to be tough, standing at the same porch where her mother had taught her to sing. Neighbors said they saw her walking alone at dusk, whispering lyrics into the wind. One of them later recognized the line in her new song, "Love doesn't end, it just changes address." For Reba, Brandon's death wasn't the end of a chapter, it was the completion of one. The bond that began in 1989, when a young stepmother tried to fit into someone else's story, had become something eternal. Not by blood, by choice. At 70, Reba McEntire had lived every shade of loss a woman could, as a daughter, a wife, a mother, and an artist. But in that loss, she found something that fame had never given her: the courage to love openly.
The secret was never scandal. It was devotion. The kind the world rarely notices until it's gone.
September 2025. At the Emmy Awards, cameras followed a familiar figure gliding down the crimson carpet, red hair gleaming under white lights, a smile, quiet but unbroken. On her hand, a black ring caught the flash. Reporters leaned in, asked if Rex Lynn was her fiancé. Reba didn't correct them. She just said, "It's a symbol of something that never ends." They thought she meant love. She meant remembrance. That night, when the orchestra swelled and applause filled the hall, she wasn't just another legend returning to the stage. She was a woman who had lived every note of her own songs. The ache, the grace, the redemption. Behind her stood 50 years of history, a father who never said, "I love you," a husband who left, a plane crash that stole her friends, and a son who taught her that family isn't blood, it's choice. Reba McEntire no longer sang to prove anything. She sang to keep people alive, the ones who had burned out before her, and the one who had called her mom. When the show ended, she walked off stage and whispered to a journalist nearby, "You can survive anything if you let love change its shape." That line became the final lyric of her next album, and perhaps the truest summary of her life. Because when the music fades and the spotlight dies, what remains isn't the fame, the fortune, or the trophies. It's the echo of a woman who turned tragedy into legacy, the voice that refused to break, the mother who chose to love, even when the world called it something else. In Hollywood, every spotlight hides a shadow, and sometimes that shadow is not scandal, it's sacrifice. Reba McEntire's story isn't about fame or fortune. It's about the weight of love, the cost of survival, and the quiet strength of a woman who never stopped singing, even when the world went silent. Behind the rhinestones and the ovations lies something far more human, a mother's heart that chose devotion over distance, a voice that refused to fade, and a life that proves light can come from even the darkest loss. If you believe that every legend carries a hidden truth, stay with us. Subscribe to Beyond the Red Carpet, because behind the fame lies the untold truth.